not one to suspect in a mystery story, if there were anything to suspect him of.
All right, so we're going to get into this book today. It's called Underwater Ghost Towns of North Georgia by Lisa M. Russell. All right, so we're going to belly flop to a part of the introduction of this book. And it says, imagine a time when not one natural lake existed in North Georgia. Erase the lake before you and replace it with a valley and a river. Envision the farmer and his family. Try to think about the churches and their dead before reinterment. The animals and hunting grounds now replaced with stocked fish. All of these things were relocated by government decree for a state hungry for power and control. The New South needed power, and the lowlands required flood control. The solution was to cut off the aggressive rivers and build a dam across. Something wild was lost in the process. The original naturalness of North Georgia is gone. All right, so welcome to everybody. Just want to read that real quick. Today we're going to get into this book, which is going to show us that there are many towns that are under these lakes where they build these dams. As I was saying here, a time when there was no lakes in North Georgia, and that is very true. We're actually going to get into another book, not on this video, and we're going to show what the landscape looked like before the lakes in North Georgia. All of the lakes in North Georgia are man-made. They didn't exist there naturally. It was just rivers and valleys, a lot of beautiful land, little towns clustered here and there. And when they're telling you envision the farmer and his family, this would include a lot of your ancestors too, if your family was from North Georgia. We already know before Europeans arrived, this was indigenous land. So this is what they're flooding. As I said there, something wild was lost in the process. Something indigenous as well. As we visit these lakes, imagine floating in the middle, leaning over and staring deep into the murky green waters. Look long enough to see the underwater ghost towns of North Georgia. While not every lake in North Georgia is mentioned in this book, the story is repeated at each reservoir. This is a biography of a region transformed by perceived needs. This tale is a memoir of the rivers forced into unnatural reservoirs, tamed for progress, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. What is in the future? Will more rivers be tamed and fake lakes created? That part of the story is yet unwritten. The land before the lakes. The difference between God-made and human-made. Sir James Wright, the third and last of Georgia's royal governors, wanted to settle the land. So in a 1772 trip to England, he hoped to attract new settlers to the state. Thus, he produced brochures promising safe and secure land for each family. In 1793, Bartram expanded on Wright's description of North Georgia's, a body of excellent and fertile land, well watered by innumerable rivers, creeks, and brooks. Rivers once defined Georgia's landscape. Reservoirs or human-made lakes may irritate the environmentally aware. However, the UGA River Basin Science and Policy Center asserts Georgia's streams and rivers have shaped the state's development while supporting a rich biological heritage. The state boasts 269 different freshwater fishes. Only Tennessee and Alabama have a larger variety. North Georgia had no major natural lakes. North Georgia has reservoirs. A reservoir is an artificial lake stored behind a dam that has blocked the natural flowing water. In the early 1900s, Georgia constructed dams for hydropower, flood control, and water navigation. Recreation was an afterthought. Reservoirs appeared in the early 1900s when the Georgia Power Company impounded waters for use as cooling structures for coal-fired electrical plants and hydropower. Tennessee Valley Authority for flood control and power created reservoirs in the 1930s. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers constructed dams in Georgia for navigation and flood control in the 1940s and 1950s under the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act of 1954. All right, as you guys can see, we have a little diagram here. The time periods of these artificial lakes. All these lakes were created in the 1900s, not before that. There was no natural lakes in North Georgia. We jump to chapter 1. It says here the Army Corps of Engineers. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or USACE, improved navigation on U.S. waterways. It has served as part of the Army since the American Revolution. The Continental Congress organized the Corps to assist General Washington, and the organization is still part of the U.S. Army. After the Army Corps of Engineers built and supplied the war effort and helped with post-war deconstruction of military installments, it returned to its first love of water control. Post-war Georgia, along with the rest of the Southeast, took baby steps toward environmental concerns, and the Corps moved to a more balanced approach. Environmental issues and economic benefits were growing concerns. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began building dams and forming reservoirs in Georgia for navigation and flood control in the 1940s and 1950s under the Flood Control Act of 1944 and the Watershed Protection and Flood Prevention Act of 1954, right? So they passed these little laws so they can be able to do all this stuff, huh? So it goes on to talk about how they hired archaeologists to relocate cemeteries. The Forest Division was utilized. The Corps saw no need to focus on biology, archaeology, or forestry. Ignorant of the environmental impact of human-made lakes in the 1940s and 1950s, when most of the work was completed, in more recent years, the Corps has become environmentally responsible, reversing any damage caused by these reservoirs. All right, so we go to chapter 2. It says here, Allatoona Lake, 1950. Allatoona has more identifiable towns underneath its waters than all the Great Lakes of North Georgia. Remnants of the lost towns of Etowah and Allatoona lie above the waterline. Until recently, Abernathyville was hidden. The Etowah Valley Historical Society has unearthed the existence of a community that lies just off the shores of the lake. Abernathyville lies just below the old Macedonia Cemetery in Bartow County. Allatoona has been the subject of archaeological studies that reveal a civilization that predates these forgotten towns. All right, so you guys heard that? So not only is there modern-day ghost towns under there, but there are archaeological ruins there from a past civilizations, okay? We're talking about your ancestors' ruins. A little more ahead in chapter 2, it says, Elder Bard Larkin Abernathy was part of the Abernathyville community and is now buried in the old Macedonia Cemetery. There were many Abernathys, but there were also markers with the prominent names of Sumney, Atkinson, Keever, McGee, Blackburn, Cox, Dellinger, Howell, Tidwell, and many others. The community nicknamed Abernathyville now resides beneath the murky green waters of Lake Allatoona. Abernathyville was lost to history before it was lost to the lake. Joe Head and the Etowah Valley Historical Society maintain an interactive map of communities at the Etowah Valley Historical Society Map Gallery. The map exposes areas lost to impoundment in the 1940s. One town that was unheard of until recent years was personal to Joe. He is an Abernathy. The town was named for the large family, but it may be a nickname because the Macedonia community was built from the Stamp Creek district. The locals say that Abernathyville existed before the Macedonia community. Once the Macedonia church was established, its neighbor, Abernathyville, surrendered its significance. It says here, Etowah. A macabre scene was playing out. Men in dirty coveralls removed an oxidized iron casket from the family grave and laid it beside an identical one on the tarp. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had just pulled the Iron Man of Georgia from Glen Holly, the family cemetery of the disappearing town of Etowah. The Mill City began and grew because of Mark Anthony Cooper, but now it was time to go. He was being moved across the town to Oak Hill Cemetery. His family home and what remained of his village were about to be drowned by the waters of the Etowah River. Across the lake from Abernathyville was Etowah. A single ironworks pyramid is now the only remnant of this one-time center of Georgia industry and innovation. Long before the Civil War, Etowah prospered on the edge of the Etowah River, but not much remained in the town after the Civil War. So repurposing this area for a lake was not as much a tragedy as it was for other North Georgia lost towns. Before Etowah drowned, a former resident remembered the ghost town. So these are two iron caskets. They are moving and relocating from a cemetery there, what we just read. This is the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Mark Anthony Cooper in their iron caskets that they are re-entered by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during the building of Allatoona Dam, the cursed collection, all right? So you see moving around people, cemeteries, desecrating graves. Etowah now resides at the bottom of Allatoona Lake in Bartow County, Georgia. All that remains is that one iron furnace, part of a day-use area that was once the centerpiece of a thriving industrial town. Moses Strom and his father built the iron furnaces in the late 1830s. The first industrial park of Bartow, then Cass County, was located along the Etowah River. The industry was surviving, but it took an early industrialist to take it to the next level. In 1847, Georgia's Congressman Mark Anthony Cooper and a financial partner Andrew M. Wiley purchased the furnace and many related businesses from Moses and worked together to build Etowah. The manufacturing town grew to 2,000 people at its peak and contained a rolling mill, a flour mill, a carpenter shop, a foundry, spike and nail mills, a hotel, and workers' homes. Etowah had a spur track connecting to Western and Atlantic Railroad that Cooper financed himself. The railroad had an engine called Jonah. It not only shipped freight to Etowah Crossing, Jonah even played a role in the great locomotive chase during the Civil War as well. All right, a little drawing of Etowah. We got some ruins here on the next page. Copper made and shipped pots, tools, cannons, spikes, nails, pig iron, and other molded or rolled iron. The rails for Copper's beloved railroad were first manufactured in Etowah. Many people worked to build this antebellum town, but it began with one man's passion for the land. He loved the land and the people. He fell on hard times and was rescued by his friends. He repaid those debts and went a step further. Cooper constructed a friendship monument thanking his debtors for helping him. When Etowah died, the residents moved the monument to the town square in Cartersville, where it remains to this day. When the Civil War came to North Georgia, Cooper's ironworks were first used to supply the Confederate Army. Eventually, Sherman's army rendered the works inoperable. All right, so this is an image. They're flying over the Allatoona Lake or reservoir that they created. You see, they flooded all this land right here, guys. Many little towns in this artificial lake. And here we have Mark Cooper's ironworks, Cartersville, Georgia, destroyed during the Civil War. Destroyed, huh? It's funny how these look like little pyramids, right? Here in this part, it talks about the haunting of Allatoona Pass. So many ghost stories associated to these drowned towns and villages under these lakes. You guys can find that all over the internet. They go over a story here. We're not going to go over it, but there's many ghost stories dealing with these towns and these artificial lakes. So make sure you look into that on your own if you like. All right, here's a picture of one of these towns that is under the lake right now, guys. You see? A whole town that's under the Allatoona Lake. Here's another picture showing what's under the lake as well. All this is under the lake right now, guys. Allatoona was a farming community littered with several farming plantations, according to Brenda Landers Conine, who grew up in the area before there was a lake. She said that Allatoona was a transportation crossroads and WA stop on the main road toward Atlanta before and after the Civil War. The town, established along the Allatoona Creek at the southern end of the Appalachian Mountains, was part of the Georgia Gold Rush, and local lore says silver mine was nearby. The lost town is known for a one-day skirmish in October, the Battle of Allatoona Pass. So one thing we're going to find about Georgia and a lot of these states that people don't know, it has a lot of resources and minerals. We got gold, silver, diamonds, things like that. Got precious stones in here too. And we're going to read why, because there was many volcanoes in Georgia. Continuing, it says here, original residents of Allatoona Lake area. Long before Cooper came to the Etowah River, the Civil War and the Abernathys formed their family town. There was life in the area now called Lake Allatoona. A 1984 geologic and archaeological study found that the area has been witness to a long and eventful human occupation. The report also suggests that more work is required to fill in the holes in the region's history. In the early 1800s, Cherokees were the main inhabitants along the Etowah River in North Georgia. I don't know how correct that would be, guys. That might be actually Creeks, right? That would be there, but it could be also so-called Cherokees. Maps prepared for the 1832 land lottery, when they were giving away indigenous land, left us with documentation to help reconstruct the Cherokee lands in North Georgia. The State Survey submitted information about the rivers, streams, land quality, and how the Indians improved the land. Attitudes shifted toward the Cherokee between the 18th and 19th centuries, and these years, everything changed between the whites, so-called whites, and so-called Native Americans. Indian traders were the key players in the acculturation process, right? That also includes so-called Black Europeans. Traders had not set out to civilize the American Indians, but the natives adopted European ways. A little more ahead, it says, although many people came to mine gold in Lumpkin County, beginning in the lost town of Awadaria, most were not permanent settlers. Many moved on to Alabama, Colorado, and California. The 1832 gold lottery, however, created white settlements, so-called. In 1831, Georgia's government knew the Indians would be removed and surveyed more than 6,800 square miles and divided the land into 4 sections. Land districts were laid off in 9 square mile sections and then divided further into 40-acre gold lots. The gold lots were designated as such because the land might contain gold. Other areas were laid off into 150-acre land lots. A public lottery distributed the 60 land lots and 33 gold districts. So-called whites poured in to claim the land. Some Indians left before they were evicted. Some patient landowners waited until the final removal of the Cherokees in 1838, 1839, removal of your ancestors. All right, we continue. It says here, Six's Old Town. Hidden below the surface of Lake Allatoona is the lost town of Sixes, an early, maybe the earliest Cherokee village in the Cherokee Nation, formed around 1799. Located near the intersection of the Etowah and the Little River, Six's Old Town lies in the middle of the lake. According to Goff's Place Names of Georgia, the area also was called Six's Old Town, Six's District, Six's Creek, Six's Mine, Six's Trail, and Sutali. Today you can drive toward Cherokee County on Highway 20 and see the community of Sutali. This was part of the Sixes community. Sixes is the English perversion of Sutali, Sutali, and no one is sure what it means. Some say the area was named for the 6 gold mines that have long since played out. The Georgia Militia District number 1279 in southwest Cherokee County is where Sixes Creek turned into the old Sixes gold mine. 6 miles southwest of Canton, a mine began producing gold in 1831. In 1849, while so many rushes to California, Sixes mines produced $200,000. All right, gold in Georgia, guys. Before the waters flowed to form Allatoona Lake, Sixes was a town of open fields, and the plantation of Joseph E. Brown. Before that, 400 Native Americans lived in the settlements. American Indians, right? This is where they're fighting, guys. All right, how many? 400 American Indians lived in the settlement. In 1833, the town had a chief named Strom. The confusion about the name's origin deepened when Goff suggested that the word Sixes might refer to a designation of an important person, like a chief. Another explanation in place names of Georgia asserts that the Cherokees used numerals with a noun suffix titled tehe or tihi, signifying killer, to indicate various graduations in rank. So Six Killer, another name for Sixes, was an important name with war implications. It says here Victoria's Secret. Victoria Harbor Marina on the Cherokee County side of Lake Allatoona has the best sunsets. According to the local lake enthusiasts, along those banks, several boaters on Lake Allatoona have reported ghostly images on their boats, sonar of an old iron bridge. These fish finder images foster speculation that there was a bridge sunk in Lake Allatoona, but there is no evidence. It's a mystery. Lake Lanier has several bridges and roads that were submerged, but they are recorded. After searching, the only evidence of a bridge goes back to the 1800s in a place called Victoria's Landing. Victoria was a community a mile from the marina. It was on the former Lovingood Road that went to Lovingood's Bridge and crossed the Etowah River. Lovingood Road was renamed Victoria Landing Drive. A town grew up around the crossroads and a store. The owner of the store, Mr. Robinson, named the town after his wife, Victoria. Lovingood's Bridge was one of the few bridges that crossed the Etowah during the Civil War. Both sides used it to cross, and Sherman used it in his march to the sea. It was mentioned in official dispatches and soldier diaries during the conflict. Farming is over. Taking a significant leap from the early 1830s, farming in the Lake Allatoona environment was over by the mid-1920s, all right? Farming is over. They stopped you from growing your own food. The farms around the Allatoona Lake area were small and focused on subsistence crops such as corn. Cotton was for cash. The rich bottomlands near the Etowah River grew corn, and the steep slopes grew cotton. Production slowed as the land was depleted. In 1957, the Atlanta Constitution ran a column by Calvin Cox titled, "Farmers Migrated en Masse to Cities." It stated, "Missing 60,374 farms." You see how many farms went so-called missing? They got rid of 60,000 farms. Last seen in the state of Georgia. Description, rather small, some with deep furrows across the face, many dressed in nondescript, one-crop clothing, worn and tattered. Disappeared during the years 1950 to 1955. Cox pointed out that in 1920 there were 310,732 farms in Georgia. And by 1957, only 165,532 farms remain. The columnist blames many missing farms' acres on the reservoirs that sprang up in the 1950s. He lamented, "Fish swim where the cotton bloomed and corn tassel waved in the gentle breezes." Allatoona Lake put its wet hand across the land, and Lake Lanier today is stretching out its fingers. There are others. Land changes and the people change. The small units fall apart, whether they be farms or people. Dramatic change in the Etowah Valley. Beloved Atlanta Constitution columnist Celestine Sibley wrote an article in 1949 marking the dramatic change in the Etowah Valley. History-minded Georgians and visiting historians from other states are preparing today for a final pilgrimage to soon-to-be submerged land where some of the lustiest, liveliest dramas of the past were played out. Sibley reported that the Kennesaw Mountain Historical Association had a full day of events, including touring the landmarks that would soon be flooded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. When it closed the gates on Allatoona Dam in December 1949, tours included Mark Anthony's Cooper Ironworks and the foundations of his old home, Glen Holly. She wrote that the graves of the Cooper family would soon be lifted to new resting places. Continue here to the J. Strom Thurmond Lake. This is chapter 3 from 1953 when it was created. A town which has risen out of the woods in a few years as if by enchantment. George Sebald. Petersburg. Petersburg was dead long before 141 feet of lake water buried it. Drought at J. Strom Thurmond Lake exposed the red bricks and rusty pieces of relics of a rich history. Situated for success, Petersburg prospered in the late 18th century until commerce changed. From the 1780s to the 1820s, this thriving township had a purposeful beginning, but then things got complicated. Petersburg was a planned community. Over 2 centuries ago, Petersburg was Georgia's third largest city. The town had paved streets, several schools, a newspaper, and a prosperous population. Petersburg boasted of producing 6 governors and 2 U.S. senators. Petersburg prosperity was all about location and the money crop of the day, tobacco. The problem was that the town was born for tobacco and died for tobacco. When the markets changed, Petersburg became a pauper town. Transportation changed and people went west. The community died a slow, insignificant death. Before the 1850s, it was finished. About 100 years later, the area is almost entirely covered by a lake. Here we have a description of Petersburg by Longstreet. So it described the town between 1806 and 1809. It says here, Petersburg was quite an active, busy, commercial little town. It was situated in the fork of the Savannah and Broad rivers and contained some 8 or 10 stores, with the usual supplement of grog shops and the very unusual supplement of billiard tables. Notwithstanding these last, the citizens of the place were remarkable for their refinement, respectability, intelligence, and hospitality. The dwelling houses far outnumbered the stores and shops. It was separated from Lisbon by Broad River and from Vienna by the Savannah. Lisbon, we believe, could never boast of more than 2 stores and a groggery, and as many dwellings. Vienna surpassed Lisbon in everything, but exactly how far and what we are not able to say, except in John Glover's house and store, which had no match in Lisbon. Before there was a town, the Broad and Savannah rivers met to form a perfect place for a community to settle and grow. According to Rita Elliott in her thesis, The Poles of Petersburg, a multidisciplinary investigation of submerged tobacco town in Georgia. Before the town's founding, this area provided an environment conducive to trade. The Broad and Savannah rivers provided Indians and Englishmen with an easily accessible route for trading goods. Here's a little map. Okay, it's Petersburg right here. Got the Etowah River right here, as we were just reading earlier. And you can see all the other rivers, guys. Early traders took advantage of the river highways to intrude on Indian lands. Early settlers needed protection, and by 1775, Fort James was built where the rivers met. Famed botanist William Bartram described Fort James, a square stockade and block houses with swivel guns, when he traveled through the area in 1776. Before the war, the land belonged to the Creeks and the Cherokees, all right? But Wright and John Stewart, superintendent of Indian Affairs, convinced them to pay their trading debts by surrendering the area between the Broad and Savannah rivers. With the North Georgia doors wide open, enter Dionysius Oliver. Oliver received land as a Revolutionary War veteran from the state of his wartime participation. One of the grants included the area between the forks of the Savannah and Broad rivers. Oliver, a Virginian, grabbed 300 acres from the Georgia General Assembly and a land grant on January 12, 1784. This ground belonged to the Cherokees and Creeks in 1773. Oliver settled at the fork of the Broad and Savannah rivers. Right? Again, I'm not saying these are all so-called Black Europeans, but just keep that in mind. We're not always just talking about so-called pale-skinned people, Europeans coming and doing all this stuff, right? A lot of these were so-called Black folks too. So here's a drawing of what they found underneath the lake, the J. Strom Thurmond Lake. And this is a diagram of the city of Petersburg under the water today. Almost 100 years later, a team of divers was investigating under the Clarksville Reservoir, now known as J. Strom Thurmond Lake. They found bricks scattered and bricks inlaid in a wall. They entered a cold channel under the lake and discovered the Savannah River channel. The researchers mapped the location of the old town, which now resides 50 feet under the lake. All right, and so this is what they mapped. Petersburg surfaced during Georgia's drought conditions. J. Strom Thurmond Lake lowered its almost 15 feet, and people saw pieces of the town for the first time since the completion of Clarksville Dam in 1943. We get a lot of questions, and we have a few people who come all the way out here just to see it, said Jerry Cook, assistant manager at Bobby Brown State Park, which straddles the lake shoreline in Elbert County. Most of what you can see is bricks from old foundations. The debris exposed during the drought is different from our trash. Rusty spikes, glass shards, bricks, lots of iron and broken pottery. During low water times, if you find a piece of the past, better leave it there. Treasure hunting is against federal laws, all right? You can't go diving there, enforced by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and by state organizations governing historic sites. A corp biologist remarked, "There's not much here today, but 200 years ago it must have been quite a place. Once the rains returned and filled the reservoir, the forgotten fragments of old roadbeds, fence lines, and foundations from the ghost town of Petersburg were lost." And we move on to Chapter 4, Lake Sidney, Lanier, 1957. Henry Shadburn was the first. On April 14, 1954, a press conference was staged. The 81-year-old old Forsyth County farmer signed over his farm to the government. And with that, Lake Sidney Lanier was more than just a plan. It was becoming a reality. Shadburn was paid $4,100 for 100 acres near the Young Deer area of Forsyth. In 2018 dollars, he sold his homestead for $36,798. The amount seems minuscule considering a lifetime of working the land and building a home. Many residents were happy with the cash in hand, others fought to stay, but in the end, over 700 families were forced out as the water behind Beaufort Dam rose. At first, the government assured landowners that they were being paid for the true value of the land and buildings, but residents found it hard to price generations of memories, hard work, and deep roots. A host of emotions accompanied the talk of relocation: anger, resentment, fear, anxiety, bewilderment, and apprehension. Most felt it was not fair to give up everything. To them, their land was priceless. All right? You hear that? They were forcing people to move. A lot of people didn't want to leave, even though a lot of people sold it happily. Many didn't. Can you imagine losing your land like that? By and large, most landowners were happy to get money in their pockets. As subsistence farmers, this may have been the most money they had ever seen. They fed their families with what their farms produced. Cash money was rare. After the press conference, Henry Shadburn, with check in hand, asked his lawyer for $10. He had to pay for deeds transfer fees. Here's a picture of one of the houses, they forced people out of. All right, they label it A103, Building 1. So after Mr. Shadburn had sold his house, says he was sitting on his new front steps near Lake Lanier, right? So after he had been relocated, Shadburn had a chance to settle in and think about his deal with the government. His wife sat rocking on the front porch as they both looked longingly in the direction of Lanier and the property that had been in his family for 5 generations, all right? 5 generations, they just took it from him. That's a lot of generations, all right? Shadburn echoed J.P. Gaines. I don't like it at all. Miss Shadburn signed, it'll never feel like home. All right? This is how they were feeling after they had sold it and been relocated. As the lake filled, local residents could not resist watching it rise. They gathered on old bridges before they were covered with water. They watched lost items float around the reservoir, and some get caught by the dam gates. Traffic jams formed on narrow roads when gawkers stared at the things soon to be out of sight. Lost to the waters, local history was disappearing before their eyes. All right? In 2008, Georgia was experiencing a severe drought. The lakes of North Georgia dropped to their lowest level since impoundment. Lanier had interesting artifacts surface, lost roads, not seen in 50 years resurfaced. The usual tires and boat parts were cemented in the red mud, but an eerie grandstand rose from the water. Looper's Racetrack, or Gainesville Speedway, was created out of Max Looper's cornfield in 1947. For 10 years, the half-mile dirt track sat beside the Chattahoochee River, providing entertainment for Forsyth and Howell counties. According to ESPN, the track was playground for the first generation of NASCAR drivers. All right, you hear that history? Regular men with regular jobs and irregularly fast cars who often trafficked the moonshine into the mountains. Then the lake closed the tracks. During the drought, the cinder block grandstand appeared again. So here's some old pictures of the racetrack before the dam was built. Here's another one. All right. Says here Looper grandstand revealed during the Georgia drought 2009. All right. Part of the racetrack. One historic loss to the area was Vance Tavern. In 1956, Vance Tavern was disassembled at the Lake Lanier site and rebuilt in the new Etowah State site. The Cherokee Nation's Memorial in Gordon County was under development. The cabin built in 1805 by Cherokee James Vann became the first building in the extinct Cherokee Village. The tavern was built in soon-to-be flooded Oscarville. Each piece was marked and plans written to make the reconstruction easier in New Etowah. As Van's Tavern was being put back together, a time capsule was embedded between the stones of the fireplace and covered with mortar. Inside the cylinder was a cover from Dr. Henry Malone's book, Cherokees of the Old South. The new Etowah issue of Early Georgia was included with a joint issue of Gordon's County News and the Calhoun Times containing a story and a picture of the tavern. Also, three 1956 pennies were tossed in along with a 1955 silver dollar. Finally, a document written in both Latin and English was included in the time capsule. And again, we got more ghost stories. This is here the ghost of Lake Lanier. There are stories of catfish as big as a Volkswagen under the water near a bridge. The tale goes that a chicken truck dumped its load into the lake and the catfish grew fat. Divers have sworn to seeing these monstrous fish. YouTube abounds with divers' videos of sunken houseboats and strange treasures of no value. Tales may have a grain of truth, but over 600 deaths on the lake since 1956 are hard to ignore. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported in May 2017 that since 1994, at least 160 people have died on the lake. In 2016 alone, Lake Lanier saw 17 deaths. DNR spokesman Mark McKinnon said, "There are simply more incidents on Lanier due to the volumes of visitors." McKinnon asserts that Lanier has more visitors than any other lake in Georgia. But logic goes out of the window when you learn that some bodies were never recovered. All right, so that's where they get their ghost stories and all that. And you got an apple cider stand before it was flooded. Here we got another house which contained a mill. This is the mill that they had in their house. This is the house. E.W. Scales home and mill, right before it was flooded. This is underwater now. Lloyd Cecil Martin remembered the day the river died. As a boy, Martin plowed crops in the rich bottom land of the Chestati River, now covered by the waters of Lake Lanier. One day it ran, and the next day it stopped. The Chestati and Chattahoochee are the feeders supplying the reservoir. Martin grieved over the loss. He missed the lifestyle in the valleys of Hall. He reflected, "You can't imagine how pretty it was. Fertile, black soil." All right? Kemet, right? What does Kemet mean? Rich, fertile, black soil. That's what Kemet means. Plentiful rabbits, squirrels, and fish. Few people. Fields known by name, such as Jay's Bottom and Kettleberry Bottom. All right? This is what's on the lake now. The lake claimed more than 56,000 acres. All right, 56,000 acres, and more than 700 families were displaced. All right, a lot of people losing their land. Many acres of that land belonged to the Martin family. The water rose and covered their fields. Martin's father left a large harrow in one of the fields. They were no longer needed. Now it is buried over 20 feet of silt, Martin said. "I never did like the lake, and I don't like it now." We continue, says here, Chapter 5, Lake Hartwell, 1962. Eliza Brock was 78 years old when she confronted the men clearing the land for Hartwell Dam with her daughter and a rifle. It was 1956 and the contractors had just started clearing her 103 acres. She had 103 acres. Brock and her daughter refused to allow them to clear her property. According to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it seems that Savannah District Real Estate Division had purchased her deceased husband's share of the land, but had only presented her a formal declaration of taking from the corpse, to which she had not agreed. Therefore, she still possessed one-half interest in the 103 acres. Brock settled out of court for $6,850. She may have been the only person in Georgia who owned land jointly with the federal government. Lake Hartwell was built with other protests and controversies that stopped progress. When it was over in 1963, the reservoir covered 56,500 acres and involved the relocation of 2 miles of the railroad and the demolition of 2 railroad bridges. New state highway sections were built totaling 19.6 miles, along with 9 sections of county roads totaling 12.7 miles. The Corps built 9 new bridges. The other controversy involved the border state and the Clemson University. Another part of South Carolina was drowned by Lake Hartwell. The lake creates a border between Georgia and South Carolina on the Savannah, Tougaloo, and Seneca rivers. Andersonville, South Carolina, was a lost town before the lake because the water transportation failed and the railroad bypassed it. In 1962, Hartwell Dam drowned all but 400 acres now called Andersonville Island. Artifacts and overgrown roads on the island are the only signs that the town existed. Mrs. Brock was not the only woman who left her mark on the Hartwell area. Isaquina, The area where Lake Hartwell was built is rich in Cherokee history, right? Cherokee Creek. Many of the streams and rivers have Indian names. Isaquina, a Cherokee princess, named the streams. As she journeyed, she would mark her travel by naming streams for the miles she covered. Creeks that are now part of the Lake Hartwell were named 6 Mile, 12 Mile, 23 Mile, and 26 Mile creeks. Before and during the Revolutionary War, the region was a hotbed of anti-British activity. Here we got a picture of what it says here. Before 1963, the Memorial Bridge was the main way to get over the river to Clemson. The bridge was covered by Lake Hartwell, all right? This is underwater right now. And this is part of the bridge during the 2008 drought. That reservoir covered 56,500 acres and merited the relocation of 3 sections of railroad totaling 2 miles, the demolition of 2 railroad bridges, construction of 6 sections of new state highways totaling 19.6 miles, and 9 sections of county roads totaling 12.7 miles, 9 new bridges, and the raising of 4 existing bridges, and the relocation of 2 power transmission lines. One of the drowned bridges that resurfaced during that 2008 drought was the Memorial Bridge. Lake Hartwell spans 2 states, and this bridge joins South Carolina and Georgia next to Clemson University. A plaque on the old sunken bridge reads, Memorial Bridge dedicated to the men of Clemson College who gave their lives during the war. Chapter 6, Carter's Lake, 1977. It says here, the dam. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began the impoundment process by building Carter's Dam, which would stop the swiftly flowing Coosa and create Georgia's deepest reservoir, Carter's Lake. That was the landscape before Georgia's need for power and control began in the early 1900s. As electricity became a necessity and no longer a novelty, the New South was in need of cheap ways to produce power. Before the dam, there were falls that were 10 to 15 feet high, all right, waterfalls, now submerged under the 400 feet of water, and the waters do not run wild and strong. Coosa. Long before moonshiners and crazy mountain people lived in the Carter's Lake area, there was Coosa, spelled variously the Coosa or Coosa. Jim Langford, an expert on North Georgia American Indians and archaeologist, confirmed that the Indian capital village existed where the lake stands today. All right, that's a big one. You see, they flooded the epicenter of the Coosa tribe, their ancestral land. You hear that? You see what they're flooding? Along the banks of the Coosa, one of the most turbulent rivers of North Georgia, the people of Coosa thrived. Coosa was the name of the village and the entire chiefdom that stretched over several hundred miles from Knoxville, Tennessee to Montgomery, Alabama. These Indians were ancestors of the Creek. The name Coosawati means old place of Coosa in Cherokee. Langford suggested De Soto's visit was the beginning of the apocalypse for the Coosa people. The Spanish were looking for gold, but deposited the seas along the Coosawati and the capital city. The chief of the Coosa people, the paramount chief, received the strangers into his territory. Langford described the paramount chief dressed all in white feathers and carried by his men, all in white feathers. Coming down from his mound, he was so special that his feet were never to touch the ground. You hear that? So he lived on a mound and was carried by his servants. Despite the warm welcome, De Soto was not a nice guest. He captured the chief and other relatives, parading them as prisoners through the streets of Coosa. He took prisoners on his trek to Mexico. He left the area as well as a deadly legacy. All right? They enslaved who? Not Africans, the Coosa people, and even took them over to Mexico. We got this in my slavery videos. Make sure to check those out. All right? Yes. This is the history that they don't tell us about. 20 years after De Soto's visit, birth rates and population had dropped. The villages were vacant. Eventually, these once great people died out. By the 1600s, 90% of the native population had died or moved downriver, looking for family, food, and transportation. Coosa was a remote place. This left most of North Georgia abandoned until about 1750. You see what happened? When Cherokees from North Carolina and Tennessee drifted into the area. Oh, that's how the Cherokees got the land. They were trying to get away from white settlers who were pressuring them to leave, so-called white, right? Free whites, talking about status. The Coosa Valley then became the capital of the Cherokee Nation. The capital village was Tenaule, located a few miles upstream from the New Etowah. The capital moved to the newly created town of New Etowah in about 1817. The area around the Cosawati was rugged with steep mountain walls and deep valleys. It remained remote and natural until the early 1970s. Continuing, it says here, pre-dam days. Editor of Backroads, Georgia, Daniel N. Roper said, beautiful Carter's Lake cannot disguise the serpentine route once taken by the Cosawati. Roper described how the Elijah and the Cartercade rivers combined in downtown Elijah and fell west through the mountains before it was dammed. The river cascaded over a series of ledges and shoals in the Cosawati River Gorge, all right? Talking about majestic waterfalls here in Georgia. Through a narrow cleft, the Cosawati once carried runoff from 376 square miles of watershed into the flat lands of northeast Calhoun, or the Great Valley. The river often threaded Calhoun and Rome with extra water before the impoundment. In 1945, Congress enacted legislation that began the process of clearing land and building Carter's Dam. Then the impoundment of what is now the deepest reservoir in Georgia, Carter's, as it is known by the locals. The project was completed by 1970. The same year, James Dickey published his best-selling Deliverance. Continues, says here, Richard B. Russell Lake, 1985. And real quick, this lake didn't have any supposed towns under it, but it says that the University of Georgia conducted archaeological studies on the Russell Lake area before the dam was closed in 1970. Researchers found prehistoric and pre-ceramic artifacts that proved the area had a small band of archaic hunters. 3 prehistoric fish traps were located within the Savannah River Channel at Cherokee Shoals and Trotter's Shoals. Other items found in the lake basin include a farm, a mill site, and a 19th century ferry crossing, all right? And then it just goes on to say that this lake was literally very planned out. It was designed to support a hydropower, recreation, water supply, flood control, and fish and wildlife conservation. It just talks about what it was doing, producing and stuff. It doesn't get into any underwater towns or anything like that. So when you get to the end of this part, you end up in part 2. We're going to read that in the next part. We're going to try to read this whole book. So I hope you guys enjoyed that first part so we can continue reading. I got another great book coming. It's called The Forgotten History of North Georgia. It's going to correlate with this. You guys will see. We're learning a lot about Georgia. Very ancient land here. You guys can see that a lot of these so-called ghost towns were actually owned by the American Indians, right? This was their ancient lands. We just remembering what has been forgotten. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Thanks for tuning in once again. I really appreciate you guys always. Pura vida, mi gente. Hawa.